Just check I'm on. Well, good evening and welcome to all of you who are watching out there in internet land. I'm speaking to you this evening from the meeting hall at Bootham School, which is sadly and strangely empty. It's very often quiet being a Quaker school because we sit there like that. But for it to be as empty as this is a real shame. But it's great to welcome you to Bootham. And it's a real privilege to be asked again this year to host this lecture on behalf of Refugee Action York. This time last year, we were in here in very good numbers listening to Gulwale Pasale, author of The Lightless Sky, who gave us a superb reflection on his experience as a refugee, something that will stay with me for a very long time. We've got an equally good, but maybe somewhat different angle on the subject that is so close to so many hearts this evening. It's a privilege to welcome you all here. It's a privilege to welcome our speaker, who I will introduce very shortly. The plan for this evening is that Alexander Betts will talk to us for 25 to 30 minutes, and then we will be open to questions. If you'd like to ask a question, the way to do that is to use Facebook if you're watching on Facebook, or to sign in to YouTube if you have an account that enables you to do that. And if you do either of those two things, you can send a question as we go through. We will see them here and we'll pick the ones that appear to have most relevance, I think, to the widest number of people. So please do feel free to send questions in as we go, particularly towards the end, when you've got a sense of the scope of what we're going to be talking about tonight. Refreshments this evening, well, that's completely up to you. So if you want to wander away and get yourself a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or a piece of banana cake at some point, then please feel free. But we're not providing anything this evening for obvious reasons. It's my great pleasure to introduce somebody this evening who I last came across when he was 17. So it's quite a lot of years ago. And that is Alexander Betts. He is the Leopold, I'm going to put my glasses on to read this because I've got to get this right. The Leopold Muller Professor of Forced Migration and International Affairs at the University of Oxford and a Senior Fellow at Brasenose College as part of that institution. Alexander was educated at Bristol's very finest school that has a reputation for producing excellent and extremely well-rounded and erudite individuals, and completed his degree at the University of Durham, went then to Bristol and to Oxford University to do further degrees. He's really majored in his career on issues surrounding the politics and economics of refugees, particularly to do with forced migration. And a key element of his thinking is about encouraging people to see that the positive contribution that refugees make to the societies in which they settle, and the activities and the richness that they bring to those societies. He's worked with a number of nations. He's worked in a number of international organizations, dealing with and advising on refugee policy and leading in those areas. He's married to Emily, who is also an alumna of that very, very fine Bristol school that I spoke about earlier. And together they have 2.5 children, the half due in October. Very disappointingly, he supports Bristol's second best football team. He was the former European debating champion in his youth, I'm told, and has run the London Marathon in a little over 2 minutes 38 seconds in 2017, which means one thing: he's getting slower as he gets older. It is my very, very great pleasure to talk to us tonight about refugees in the time of COVID-19. A former pupil of mine, but someone who's progressed far further than I ever will. Alexander Betts, welcome to Alexander.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that extremely warm welcome. I'm really delighted to be able to speak to you and to everyone who's joining us this evening. I'm only sorry that I'm not there in York in person, but I'm really privileged to have this invitation from Bootham School and from Refugee Action York. It's very touching to be able to do this and have the invitation from Chris, because as Chris said, he was my history teacher when I was 11 years old. And I know that seems pretty unbelievable because he doesn't look a day older than me. But nevertheless, he was my teacher when I was 11. And at that time, he was probably no more than 12 or 13 himself. Some of the references to Bristol might seem a bit obscure from a Yorkshire perspective. but nevertheless, I am a proud Bristolian, and it's good to have a bit of football rivalry in the introduction. What I should also do to situate this in context is say something about how I've come to work on refugee issues. As you'll be aware, I am a white man, and a middle-aged white man. What do I have to say at the start of Refugee Week about refugees? Well, I have no experience of what it is to be a refugee, and I don't claim to. I think it's increasingly important that we ensure that refugees speak to their own experiences, that they're involved in participating very much in the decisions that affect their lives. But nevertheless, my experiences and my career as an academic have focused very much on trying to think about how we can improve opportunities for refugees and displaced people around the world. And it was actually a little bit after the time that Chris mentioned that I became really interested in thinking about and understanding the situation that refugees find themselves in, why they're in those situations, and what, if anything, we can do to improve their protection and enable them to lead dignified and meaningful lives despite fleeing war and authoritarian regimes. And that moment for me was when I was 19 years old, and I was an undergraduate a little bit further north than York, in Durham, and I had a long summer holiday ahead of me. And like many undergraduate students, I had a lot of free time, not a lot of money, and I didn't know very much about refugees, but I had the chance to go and be a volunteer in a reception centre for asylum seekers and refugees in the Netherlands, in a little town called Heerenveen. And Heerenveen was tiny and obscure, but it had a reception centre for refugees just outside the town. And when I was there, I wasn't doing very much because I was 19, had very few skills, very few qualifications, but I spent some time helping to build a playground for the kids and spending my evenings chatting to people. I was living in the reception centre for a few weeks. And while I was there, I met people who had fled conflict in Kosovo, Bosnia, Liberia, who'd fled the regimes that occupied their countries in Iraq, Iran, the Chinese government, Christians who had left Pakistan, the full spectrum of people from around the world, all living together. And what I expected was to feel an incredible sense of pity. These people were in really difficult situations. But what I actually found was an incredible source of inspiration. A Bosniak lawyer taught me the basics of public international law. An Iranian Olympian taught me how to play very bad table tennis. And I met people who were doctors, who were lawyers, who had incredible skills, talents, and aspirations. And I was inspired by that. But the thing that also struck me was that in that situation, many people weren't allowed to work. They were stuck in limbo, waiting in a bureaucratic process, unable to use their skills and talents to contribute to the societies they were part of, just because of the legal framework, which meant they weren't allowed to work as asylum seekers. They had to first get their refugee status or wait a period of time. And that was really shocking to me, given the skills that these people had. And so I went away as a 19-year-old, studying economics at the time, and thought, I want to understand why people would make these decisions. Why would any society take really talented people that want to contribute and push them out of labour markets, not let them make those contributions? And so I went and discovered that there was a library in Oxford at a place called the Refugee Studies Centre, and stayed on a friend's floor and did more research and started writing about this, and wrote my undergraduate degree dissertation that was in economics about the economic lives of refugees. But the more I travelled after that to refugee camps in other parts of the world, in Africa, the more I found the same situation replicated. People who were really talented were unable to work simply because they fled war and authoritarian governments. In refugee camps across Africa, people were effectively warehoused. They'd be in camps for 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20 years. Kids would be born into those camps and they would be denied the opportunity to contribute. So what I've really tried to do since then is think about the politics of why elected leaders make decisions to exclude talented people from participating in their economies, and why it is economically that refugees do contribute and don't need to be seen as a burden, a cost to their societies, but can actually be a benefit and an asset. So Luke, if I could have the first slide, please, that would be great. So I'm going to talk about refugees in times of COVID-19. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk about three things. I want to talk a little bit about giving you an overview of refugees in the world today. Who are refugees? Why are they in the situation they're in? And what does some of the distribution of displaced people around the world look like? Secondly, I want to talk about where we are now, COVID-19, something that is affecting all aspects and all areas of our lives, of society, but has particular effects on some of the most vulnerable, including refugees and displaced people. And thirdly, I want to ask, well, what can sustainable solutions look like in the future? How can we think proactively and hopefully about the ways in which we can restore refugees dignity, purpose, and sense of direction in lives, despite having had to leave the countries they come from. So could I have the next slide, please? When you think about refugees and displaced people, there are probably a couple of images that will spring to mind. The kind of images that we see on the US-Mexican border and in the Mediterranean. Thousands of desperate people trying to enter rich countries, not because they just want better lives, but very often because they're forced to flee and have nowhere else to leave. And these are two of the most high-profile scenarios that attract the greatest media attention. So on the left, you'll see the so-called migration caravans, groups of people who at different points over the last couple of years have moved from Central American countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, for a whole host of reasons: gang violence, weak governance, increasingly climate change, and tried to cross the US-Mexican border. Now, under the Trump administration, it's been increasingly difficult for those people to get into the US. We've seen images on our televisions of children being separated from their parents and incarcerated. We've seen images of people being refused admission to the asylum processes that are meant to assess who is a refugee and who's not, and sent back across the border into Mexico. And the situation has become so desperate for a variety of reasons in Central America that in the last year, the United States has received more asylum seekers at its border than at any time than during the previous 15 years. That's people leaving the so-called triangle of countries of Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, but it's also, to a lesser extent, Venezuelans, Haitians, trying to flee their own countries and move north. Then to the right, you'll see the scenario that we often witness in the Mediterranean. Across the central Mediterranean, with people traveling from North Africa to Italy or to islands like Malta, the Western Mediterranean, moving from the Canary Islands to the south of Spain. But as we saw in 2015 and 16, during what was called the European refugee crisis, many people crossed the Aegean Sea from Turkey to Greece and risked their lives in doing so. And in 2015 and 2016, over 1 million people, mainly Syrians, came to Europe as asylum seekers. They went mainly to Germany and Sweden, but also spread across Europe to the UK and elsewhere. Most of them were Syrians fleeing the violent conflict in Syria. Most had fled initially to neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, but unable to get adequate assistance, unable to get access to work in those countries. From 2014, the end of that year, they started coming to Europe in increasing numbers. Tens of thousands of people have drowned in the Mediterranean. Europe's response to asylum seekers and refugees was poorly coordinated and didn't respect human rights law, let alone refugee law, and was a really damning indictment of the response. But what I want to suggest is that those images that we see so often in the media, the US-Mexican border and the Mediterranean, don't do justice to the global picture of refugees, of why so many people are coming to Europe and the reasons behind that, but equally giving us a perspective that most refugees don't come to Europe, don't move to North America, but are actually elsewhere in the world. Could I have the next slide, please? I think knowing that all of you will come to this talk with different degrees of background in thinking about refugees, I think it's very important that I should be very clear about some definitions. Who is a refugee? Who is a migrant? Who is an internally displaced person? What those labels make and why they exist. So an international migrant is basically anybody who crosses an international border and stays for a period of time. The international organizations generally refer to as a migrant who crosses the border and stays for at least 2 years somewhere else. And they can be a migrant regardless of why they're going. It might be for work, it might be to join up with their family, it might be to study as a student. It can be for any reason. Someone who moves abroad for a couple of years or more is a migrant. A refugee means something much more specific. It means someone generally who has had to leave their country because there's a war or a conflict in that country, or they're fleeing an authoritarian government that doesn't respect their human rights. And in 1951, these people you see on the screen joined together to create something called the Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees. And that convention, created in 1951, was a response to the huge numbers of refugees who had been displaced by the Second World War and were increasingly being displaced by the early part of the Cold War, many people fleeing communist countries in the East to the West. And as took place after the Second World War, nation states, the victors of the Second World War, came together and said, how can we ensure this never happens again? How can we ensure that people who are in totalitarian regimes, like Nazi Germany, like the Soviet Union, can flee for their lives, can leave the tyranny of persecution and go somewhere else? How can we ensure that they have a right to do that, but also that governments everywhere have an obligation to open their borders, to admit them to their countries and respect their rights? And that convention, the 1951 convention, which is still around today, offered a definition of who is a refugee. It defined refugees as people who are outside their country of origin because of a fear of persecution on one of 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership of a social group, or political opinion. So it's because of something about their identity, who they are, that their government won't tolerate them, won't respect their human rights, and they have to leave that country. Now, the drafters of that convention didn't just create it because of human rights reasons, although that was important. They also created the refugee system because they recognized that if refugees didn't have places to go in an organized and systematic way, that would be a source of instability. That if all countries shared the responsibility, that would be a lesser responsibility for any individual one state, and it would be shared across countries in a coordinated and collaborative way. It was seen as the right thing to do and the pragmatic thing to do. And the drafters of that convention also agreed that this would be a definition that needed to be interpreted over time, that how we thought about persecution could adapt, so that if new causes of refugee movements emerged, like different types of wars, like potentially other things that made countries inhabitable, like possibly even things like climate change, then over time, courts and government bureaucracies would be able to broaden the definition of how we think about who is a refugee. And they also at that stage created a specialist United Nations organization, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, to support governments in respecting the obligations they had towards refugees. That convention in 1951 defined who a refugee is, but also said what rights refugees have. And the key right was something called non-refoulement, a French word. And non-refoulement basically means that people can't be returned to countries where they face serious harm. So if they've had to flee serious harm, or a threat or a belief that they face a serious harm, they cannot be returned, and their rights have to be respected while they're in exile. And that endures today, but it's a system that is increasingly under threat. It's a system where many of those core rights, including non-refoulement, are being actively called into question by the practices of governments in Europe, in North America, and Australia. Some of the richest countries in the world are increasingly flagrantly violating and challenging those basic standards that were agreed upon after the Second World War. Could I have the next slide, please, Luke? So how many displaced people are there today? Well, there are about 25.9 million refugees in the world, and that number is more than at any time since the Second World War. But that number of refugees is a subset of a broader figure, the number displaced in the world. And that bigger figure of displaced, 70.8 million people, roughly the population of the United Kingdom, divides between the 25 million who are refugees and people who are displaced for reasons. The largest category of those are what are called internally displaced persons, IDPs, people who are in refugee-like situations, but haven't crossed an international border. So there are lots of these IDPs in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Colombia, where there have been long-standing armed conflict, violence, where people have had to flee their communities, but unable or haven't wanted to cross an international border. And so the number is larger than it has been since the Second World War. This is in many ways an age of displacement. But I also think it's very important that we get a sense of perspective. We often hear about asylum seekers, refugees in Europe being an unmanageably large population, but it's not. That figure of 25.9 million refugees around the entire world is still only 0.34% of the world's population. 0.34% of the world's population are actually refugees. And I think what's also important to keep in mind is that most of those, the overwhelming majority, as I'll say in a minute, are not coming to Europe, not going to North America, and not going to Australia. They're staying in neighboring countries that neighbor conflict and crisis and not moving on internationally. So I don't want to trivialize the issue, but we need to keep a sense of perspective. Could I have the next slide, please? The one thing that has been on the horizon for a long time, though, is the question of what climate change will do to displacement. As different areas of the world become uninhabitable, what will that mean for how people adapt to the challenges of either slow onset crisis, like desertification, like serious changes in temperature, like changes in land use, or rapid onset impacts of climate change, like disappearing islands in Kiribati, Tuvalu, and elsewhere in the South Pacific. What will happen when those people are affected in that way and their lands, their territories become uninhabitable? How will we respond? The World Bank has estimated that by 2050, there could be as many as 145 million people displaced as a result of climate change. Now, most of those will be displaced as IDPs, displaced inside their own countries rather than refugees. But the question we face as an international community is whether we include people affected by environmental degradation and climate change as the equivalent of refugees. Do we recognize their right to migrate on human rights grounds, or do we think of them as voluntary economic migrants? And climate change is one of many new drivers of displacement that is challenging the line between what we might regard as a voluntary migrant on the one hand, and who we might regard as a forced migrant on the other. People who have a choice and people who don't. And the photo that you see is an image taken in the Western Highlands in Guatemala. And the Western Highlands are an area where increasing numbers of people are leaving and joining those migration corridors that you saw at the start to go to the United States. And they're going for a variety of reasons, but one of those is the link to climate change. There's been decreasing rainfall in the Western Highlands over a number of years, and many of the crops that are grown in that part of the world, like maize and beans, are very sensitive to rainfall. And so with declining rainfall, crops have failed. That's led to undermining livelihoods and incomes for the population, meaning many have had to leave their lands and try to move on to look for an opportunity to make a basic living. How we think about the impact of climate change will shape who we decide to admit onto our territories and how we think about the line between who is a refugee and who is a voluntary migrant. It's really challenging how we think about this in future. Could I have the next slide, please? But I think, as I said, the other thing we need to do is recognize that the majority of the world's refugees are in some of the poorest countries in the world. Most are not in Europe and North America. 85% of the world's refugees are hosted by low and middle income countries. The reason these countries host them, countries like Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Pakistan, Iran, Thailand, Bangladesh, Colombia, they're not hosting most of the world's refugees because they're disproportionately generous, though sometimes they are. It's because of where they are in the world. It's because of geography. The mere fact of being a country that neighbours a place of conflict or crisis, that you're next to a violent country, is the reason why very often with a weak or porous border, you end up getting a lot of people coming to the country, your own country. And so actually what's going on around the world is that only 5 countries host nearly 40% of the world's refugees. And just 5 different countries, countries like Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Somalia, those types of countries are producing more than half of the world's refugees. So this is a geographically concentrated issue, and it's actually a developing world issue, for want of a better phrase. It's happening not in our rich world, but more broadly around the world, and only a tiny minority are coming to Europe or moving to North America. Next slide, please. The problem is that in those parts of the world, those countries that are low and middle income countries, the responses we have to refugees are often unsustainable. They're often just bad responses in terms of restoring people's dignity, giving them meaning and purpose, and allowing them to get on with their lives. The policies that turn people into a burden or work on the assumption that they have to be an inevitable cost to their societies, rather than responses that empower people or include them in societies to contribute economically, socially, or culturally. So one of the default responses, the ways UN agencies, NGOs, charities respond around the world, has been to create refugee camps. When people cross a border because of a war, they have immediate needs: food, clothing, shelter. And so camps are often created, like the one you see on the left, to house people. Sometimes they are just lines of tented housing in remote, sometimes arid border locations. And around 30% of the refugees are in camps. The one you see on the left is the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, home to over 80,000 Syrian refugees. But actually, since 2006, the majority of the world's refugees haven't been in camps. They've been in cities. 2006 was the year there was a tipping point where, for the first time, 50% of the world's refugees were actually in cities. But the problem with moving to cities, some of the biggest urban metropolises in the world, cities like Amman in Jordan, Beirut in Lebanon, Nairobi in Kenya, Johannesburg in South Africa, is that by moving to a city, most refugees effectively give up assistance. They don't get any aid from international organizations, except a tiny amount for the most vulnerable. And the problem is, in host countries in the developing world, is refugees are usually denied the right to work. Governments are often worried about refugees taking jobs from citizens, and so they don't let them work legally. And that means that in cities, refugees rely upon the informal economy, black market economies, if you like, in order to work, often risking exploitation, often engaging in low-wage work without any safeguards whatsoever, or they rely on their own networks, receiving what are called remittances or money transfers from relatives abroad. So many face a great degree of precarity if they choose to live to cities. And it's a tiny minority, less than 5%, who are moving onwards by boats, for instance, across the Mediterranean to the rich world. The majority are in camps or cities around the world. So I think that's really important to get a context of the kind of responses we have. But the tragedy that I want to underscore, which I started this talk with, is that in camps and cities, too often refugees are denied the right to work. They don't have the legal right to work, and rarely do they have the opportunity to work in the formal economy. And that is a great shame for reasons I'll explain. Can I have the next slide, please? I think one of the things we're faced with today is the impact of COVID-19. And COVID-19 is something that is affecting all of our lives, but has an impact on many of the most vulnerable. And we know from a lot of the data that COVID-19 has a dual effect at opposite ends of what are called population pyramids. It affects older people and richer people around the world through its health effects. The main way in which COVID-19 affects the rich and the old, many people are therefore in countries like our own, is through the health consequences, through the virus itself. But for poorer people and younger people, the main impact is economic. It's the effect it has on their income generating activities and their livelihoods. And refugees around the world, particularly in the low and middle income countries I've mentioned, are affected in three ways by the virus. First of all, they're affected by the virus itself. And although we've seen COVID-19 take hold in some refugee camps and some refugee areas in cities, relatively few refugees have actually been affected directly by the virus. The numbers remain particularly low. And that's partly because refugee camps in particular are quite isolated. They're quite remote. There's not a lot of travel backwards and forwards. The second way in which many refugees have been affected is by lockdown. So in many cities in developing countries like Kampala, the capital of Uganda, or Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, governments have implemented lockdowns in a much more rigorous way than we've even seen in the UK. They've had police out on the streets enforcing lockdown. And that's undermined people's ability to make a living in the informal economy, but it's also led to really significant food shortages. So in Kampala, the capital of Uganda, the government said that refugees and non-citizens wouldn't be allowed access to government food distribution. And so many have faced starvation. But the third, and perhaps the biggest effect that COVID-19 is going to have is on global recession. And that's what this slide is an attempt to illustrate. We know that this year alone, the predictions tell us that the global recession, the economic downturn created by COVID-19, will mean the global economy will shrink by at least 3%. And over a number of years, it may well become more than that. But the economies that are going to be most affected are some of the poorest economies in the world, the countries that refugees come from and the countries that most refugees go to. So in Africa, for instance, the region I do most of my work in, it's likely that 20 years worth of progress on international development will be wiped out by the economic effects of COVID-19. And that is going to affect the causes of forced displacement, things that drive people to leave, the consequences of displacement, the impact it has on people's lives, and the responses to displacement, the way in which governments do or don't meet the rights of refugees. And so this table is just a way of trying to think that through and ask, what is it that we know and can know about scenarios in the future for how the economic downturn will affect refugees? And there are three big causes of refugee movements and displacement: conflict, authoritarianism, and fragile states. In many ways, refugees are a symptom of bad things in our world. So when things are not right in weak or fragile countries, refugees end up being, if you like, human rights abuses made visible. They are the consequences of underlying things being wrong. And we know from existing social science that recession leads to a greater risk of conflict. So a study by Miguel et al. In 2004 showed that a 5% negative economic shock is likely to lead to a 0.5% increase in the likelihood of conflict in any given African country. We also know that economic downturn increases authoritarianism. Smolik in 2008 showed that a $1,200 increase in GDP per capita, the average income in a country, increases the likelihood of democratic consolidation, that a democracy will endure from 20% to 80%. So in reverse, as people get poorer, the chance of having authoritarian and tyrannical regimes becomes greater. And fragile states, this category of governments that are just generally weak and not very capable of supporting their own citizens, countries like Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, in those fragile countries, we know from the existing literature that GDP per capita, the average income in a country, is negatively related to indicators of fragility. So what that column on the left shows is that we're going to see rising numbers of displaced people as a result of global recession. On the consequences side, we also know from existing research that refugees are going to be some of the hardest hit. So in employment, we know from a recent study by Dempster et al., Dempster and others in 2020, that 60% of forced migrants, mainly refugees, work in the sectors, the areas of work that are most likely to be affected by COVID-19, compared to 41% of host country citizens. So refugees are more likely to work in precarious sectors of employment and more likely to lose their jobs as a result of what's going on. In terms of assistance, we know that at periods of downturn, aid flows go down. So UN agencies get less money, NGOs and charities get less money. And so we're likely to see less assistance going to provide the basic needs of refugees through humanitarian aid or development assistance. And in terms of remittances, refugees rely upon money transfer from their relatives abroad. And yet we know from what the World Bank has recently told us that remittances to low and middle income countries will fall this year by at least 20%. So people will be earning much less and struggling. But we also know from the literature that government responses are likely to be less favourable to refugees. The literature on public attitudes to immigration in Europe show that as people get poorer, they're more suspicious of migrants. The literature on people's movement highlights that in recessions, government introduces greater restrictions on immigration, new visa controls, for instance. And we're seeing that already with coronavirus leading to travel bans and restrictions that have effects on refugees in Greece, moving across Europe and elsewhere. And we also know from research that's been done across Europe that reductions in government spending, austerity measures, tend to reduce government's willingness and ability to uphold human rights. So for refugees, this is a very serious situation. COVID-19 and the recession, the economic effects, will lead to rising numbers, increasing needs, and declining political will by governments. So the thing that I want to focus on in the time I've got left is to move from that slightly negative story to a more positive story and ask what we can do to square that circle. How, with rising numbers, increasing needs, and declining political will, can we turn that around to ensure that refugees can be protected, can still flee to safety, can still get access to the basic needs, and live meaningful and dignified lives? Could I have the next slide, please? In the research I do in Oxford, we work in 3 main countries: Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda, all next to one another in East Africa. And those 3 countries are in a neighborhood of states affected by conflict or authoritarianism. They're surrounded by countries like South Sudan, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Eritrea, Rwanda. And all of those surrounding countries are either not perfect democracies and or affected by violent armed conflict. And so Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda receive significant numbers of refugees. Now, while this might seem like an obscure part of the world, one thing to note is between them, those 3 countries host more refugees than the whole of the European Union combined. So collectively, the whole of the European Union has less refugees than those 3 countries alone. And what I've tried to do with my team in Oxford is understand the economic lives of refugees in those 3 countries, in the capital cities that you see, Addis Ababa, Nairobi, and Kampala, but also in some of the main camps, the so-called Doloado camps in Ethiopia, the Kakuma camps in Kenya, and the Nakivale camps, Nakivale settlement in Uganda. And the way we work is we work actively in the field and do a lot of field research, collecting data through surveys, but we also recruit and train refugees themselves as our research assistants and enumerators, men, women, people from across nationality groups and language groups, to be able to build trust and work with the community. So just to tell you briefly about some of what we've learned, can I have the next slide, please? One of the most striking things that you see immediately in environments like these photos are from the Nakivale settlement in Uganda, which is Africa's oldest refugee settlement. It was actually created as early as 1958, when there was still British Empire in Uganda. And the settlement is still there. But what you see is not just lines of tents, not just people struggling and waiting passively for assistance. You see them getting on with their lives, earning incomes, building businesses, being entrepreneurial. The top left image shows the main travel business in the settlement. And it's actually not run by host Ugandans, it's run by Somalis. They run a bus company that will take people from the settlement to the capital city. In the top right-hand corner, you see a Somali shop where you can find just about everything you would want. And it's not just things that have been acquired in the host country, Uganda. You find tuna fish, which many Somalis in the settlement want access to, that's imported through Somali supply chains, through their networks, from the Middle East, via Saudi Arabia, into Mombasa, the main port in Kenya, into the Owino market, the largest market in East Africa, which is in Kampala, and along road networks to the settlement. You see people buying and selling old mobile phone handsets, you see airtime for sale, and you see really innovative but small scale businesses like the one on the right being a bicycle converted to a small tool sharpening business. What's unique about Uganda and settlements like this is that unlike the other countries that neighbor them, countries like Kenya, Uganda lets its refugees work. It gives them freedom of movement, and you get this kind of thriving environment of economic activity as a result. Giving refugees the right to work benefits them, it benefits the citizens of the country, and it leads to more dignified lives. Could I have the next slide, please? And this, in contrast, illustrates exactly the kind of thing we want to change. This is a typical refugee camp, the Kakuma refugee camps in the northwest of Kenya. It's an arid, remote area on the border with South Sudan, and it's home to a staggering 190,000 people. Now, I don't know what the population of York is, I should have checked, but 190,000 people living in a refugee camp is obviously an enormous number of people. And many are young people who have been there for years, 5, 10, sometimes 15 years, who have limited access to education. Most get primary education, but secondary education is much more limited. And Kenya doesn't let refugees work. It limits their right to work. It limits their ability to register businesses. And so they're effectively warehoused. They have to wait for the conflict to end in South Sudan until they can go home. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to overcome and change so that people can live with dignity and more purpose. But the thing about camps like that is if you scratch the surface, you get a very different image behind. Can I have the next slide, please? These are also images from the Kakuma camp, and yet they don't look like that line of homogenous, identical homes. The top left, you see a Somali woman running her business. In the middle at the top, you see an artist selling his paintings and his creative activities. And you see a vibrant range of cultural and creative activities going on. The top right is an image from the Ethiopian market street, lined by shops. The bottom left is a squad of runners aspiring to join the Refugee Olympic team. There's a Refugee Olympic team that would have been due to compete in the Tokyo Olympics. And then you see the odd one out, the slowest runner that was training with them. Bottom right, you see a football team called Equatoria United, which plays in the Kakuma Premier League of people aspiring to play internationally. And Equatoria United is a club that I've twinned with Oxford City Football Club, an English 7th tier team. But I suppose being in York, you'll know about 7th tier teams. So Oxford City have been twinned with Equatoria United, and there's an active football league with about 700 football teams playing in the Kakuma leagues. And then you see small agricultural activities, dry land agriculture going on. So you scratch the surface and there's potential. There's so much that's exciting and interesting going on if we could harness it and put resources into it. Could I have the next slide, please? So in our research, I tried to ask three main questions through a survey of now 16,000 plus refugee and host community respondents. We follow them over time across those camps and settlements in the three countries. And we've asked the questions that matter for sustainability. First, in terms of welfare, when do refugees thrive rather than merely survive? What explains their income levels, their wealth levels, their health, their mental health, their food security? What are the factors that shape all of those important outcomes? We've asked secondly about social cohesion. When is it that refugees and hosts get on well? When do they have good relationships with one another? When do they interact and when do they not? When's there hostility and when's there support from the host community for the presence of refugees? And thirdly, we've asked about migration. How do refugees choose where they live? When do they stay in camps and settlements or move on to cities? When do they aspire to move onwards internationally outside the countries that host them to even Europe or North America? And what we found across all those questions is a common pattern, that education and the right and opportunity to engage in meaningful work are crucial. Welfare outcomes like income, like having assets, wealth, are correlated with how much education people have got access to and their ability to work, and also whether they live in a country that lets them work or not. In terms of social cohesion, the relationship between refugees and hosts, we find that one of the biggest determining factors in whether the host community, the citizens of those countries, feel positive about refugees is whether those refugees are perceived to make an economic contribution, whether they're perceived to work and contribute to the economies they're part of. When they're able to do that, they're more likely to be perceived positively. And in terms of migration, we've also found, looking at different waves, going back to the same refugees over time and seeing who's left a camp or settlement or who's left one of these big cities and moved onwards, that the people who are leaving are not the rich ones who are doing well, not the ones who have got access to opportunity. It's the ones without opportunity who are struggling economically, who often aspire to move onwards or do move onwards. So the key is education and the right and opportunity to work, which involves having to change the regulatory frameworks in countries like Kenya that don't let refugees work. It involves having to create jobs. That's not just about what governments can do, it's about what business can do. And this is particularly now important in the context of COVID-19, when refugees are being most affected by the socioeconomic consequences of recession. But this is about empowering people to help themselves rather than assuming they need to be dependent indefinitely on long-term assistance. Can I have the next slide, please? And the final point I want to make is about COVID-19, because what we see in these camps and cities, and what I hear about from the people we've worked with in our research, is that many of the support structures that were present, international organizations, the UN, NGOs, have now left and been unable to provide support. NGOs can't do missions to these refugee camps because of COVID-19. Lockdown in cities means that there's very little ability to deliver. And the people that are supporting refugees now are refugees themselves. We see refugee-led organizations, really small grassroots organizations, stepping to the fore and providing support. On the left is an organization called Yarid, based in Kampala, that has been distributing food to the refugee communities and other basic items during lockdown. And they've not had access to funding from international governments. They've had access through crowdfunding or basic contributions by members or other people in the community, but refugees themselves have been contributing. On the right is an organization in one of the refugee settlements in the rural parts of Uganda, the Wakati Foundation, that's been sewing masks and supporting with public information around health in the absence of formal organizational support. And I think this shows the potential that refugees, given the opportunity, can not only contribute to their host countries economically, but can also support themselves if we empower them to organize, to self-govern, and make contributions. That's not saying that we don't have things we have to contribute, but it's suggesting that we can contribute to dignity, meaning and purpose in people's lives, and ultimately reduce some of the humanitarian support that's needed over time if we recognize that refugees have skills, talents, aspirations, and the ability to be a benefit to their own communities and the communities that they're a part of. Could I have the last slide, please? So I just want to leave you with 6 ideas, 6 conclusions. I've talked mainly about East Africa and the wider world, but I think these conclusions apply everywhere. They're about what I think we need to do in how we think about refugees globally, but also in the UK, in Europe, and in our own towns and cities. The first is we need to understand why refugees flee. There's a difference between being a voluntary migrant and a forced migrant. To be a refugee is to be someone who has had to flee persecution or violence, or increasingly other causes of forced displacement like climate change. And refugees are in many ways a symptom of other things that are wrong with the world, of our fragile world, which is arguably becoming more fragile. The second thing is we need to change narratives. We don't have to think about refugees as an inevitable burden. They can be a benefit to our societies, not just economically, but culturally and socially as well. Thirdly, we have to keep perspective. Most refugees are not in Europe. Europe has an obligation to support refugees, but as a proportionate and shared responsibility with the rest of the world. And at the moment, actually, Europe makes less of a contribution than many other regions of the world, even the poorest regions of the world like Africa. So Europe and the UK needs to be doing a number of things. It needs to be supporting refugees where they are in regions like Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, but it also needs to ensure that the door to Europe remains open for those that can't get protection and can't be safe in the regions they come from. And there are many reasons why that might be the case. The fourth thing we need to do is recognize capability, that refugees have vulnerabilities, they need support, but they're not just passive victims. They also have capacities, they have skills, and they have contributions to make. The fifth thing is to say, we need to show solidarity with strangers. And that's about values. It's about it being the right thing to do. Refugees have human rights, and human rights are one of the things that make our society civilized, that we respect people because they are human beings and for no other reason, that they are part of our common humanity, and that if they're in danger, that is our moral responsibility as well. But self-interest can be part of the reason why we choose to support refugees in other parts of the world, that unless we're prepared to provide ordered, structured ways to support people who flee, to give them opportunities where they are, then we're more likely to see spontaneous onward movements like we saw in 2015 and 16 with the European refugee crisis. So it should be part of our values to protect and support refugees, but it's also in our own interests to do so. And we need to act both globally and locally. These are interconnected stories. When refugees come and travel to our country or to Europe, it's because something has gone wrong somewhere else in the world. And as we know from the current context, we live in a globalized world. We may be able to suspend travel temporarily. We may be able to reduce trade for a while. But what coronavirus teaches is that an event that takes place in a market in China can have a ripple effect for the rest of the world. And with that, we have to have the solidarity and commitment to recognize that we're part of a shared humanity, and we have moral obligations as well as a shared collective interest in protecting and supporting the most vulnerable people, whether they are here or far away. Thank you very much. And I apologize for going over time.
Mute it myself. There we are. I'm not unmuted anymore. I'm sort of sitting here in this empty hall, and I am imagining the warmth and the volume of the applause that I think would have been ringing out from here at the end of that talk. I'm just spellbinding to listen to the clarity and the perspective that you've just brought, which I found really, really helpful indeed. What I'd say to those people who are watching at home is if you have questions that you would like to ask, please either use the YouTube comments or the Facebook comments to feed those questions in. Because of the nature of the screen that I'm looking at, unless your questions are relatively short and succinct, I may not be able to get the whole picture. So short, snappy questions would be really helpful if you want to ask those. I have a question, as you might be expected from a curious teacher. And I don't take it into the context that we're wrestling with in school here at the moment. And it's something that came through one or two of the comments that were appearing on my screen, certainly as I was looking at this. And that was about whether the current flow of the Black Lives Matter campaign is something that you think can be beneficial to the work that you've just urged us to be doing as a nation and as individuals, or whether something that might obscure it in the current climate.
I think the more we can be aware of the role that race plays in our societies, the better. This area around refugees and asylum seekers is obviously characterized by the role that identity plays. The very notion of persecution is about identity. It's about people fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a social group, or political opinion. It's got identity running through it. And the experiences that refugees have and the selectivity with which governments respond to them is shaped by race. And we can see that historically. You're a historian, you'll recognize this, that through a lot of the Cold War, Europe was very open to welcoming refugees. The United States was very welcoming to refugees. And that's because many of those refugees were fleeing east to west. They were fleeing from communist countries, white countries, as white refugees to white receiving countries. And the tone of the debate around refugees really changed from the late 1980s, when the movement of refugees became south-north. It became people seeking asylum in Europe and elsewhere whose skin color was different from the receiving community. And that became a particular challenge. But too often, we don't openly recognize the role that race plays in mediating our own publics and our own citizens' attitudes towards migration in general, but also refugees and asylum seekers. That someone fleeing persecution from a particular country is more likely to receive a privileged response or be welcomed than another. And I think it's just really important to start thinking about that and being aware of those different responses. One of the other things that I found particularly striking and confronting during the last few weeks of Black Lives Matter comes back to where you started the conversation around Bristol, where you taught me at Bristol Grammar School. We've seen recently in the last couple of weeks the statue of Colston, a slave owner in Bristol, being forcibly pulled down, and that's provoked considerable debate. Now, one of the things that I was very conscious of growing up in Bristol was how much of my privilege was shaped by the wealth that that city had as a result of the legacy of slavery and colonialism. And yet one of the regrets I have is that we don't think enough about the legacies of empire and colonialism. The fact that the region I've just described, East Africa, has been historically shaped by the past, and that past includes a colonial past of which Britain has been a part. Now, that doesn't make Britain responsible for every bad thing that happens in post-colonial Africa. There are many other reasons why we today have wars, conflicts, authoritarian governments. But I think what it does is it should encourage us to historicize, to reflect on what the privilege we have today is, where it's historically come from, and what consequences that has today that endure in other parts of the world, in Africa in particular, in the Middle East, that if we were part of drawing the borders of the Middle East in particular ways, if we were part of drawing borders in Africa in particular ways, and those borders are the source of ongoing conflict today, that tells us something about the role we've played, and that some of our privilege is the result of the past, and other people's lack of privilege is the result of that past. So the encouraging thing I've found in what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is the provocation to think about two things: identity, including race, and history, and how it shapes how we see ourselves in the world.
Thank you very much indeed. I was very conscious as I was looking at things last week, as I said to the students in our sort of virtual meeting last week, that as a teacher teaching you and as a student in the same school when I was younger, I was never taught about Bristol and slavery and Colston, and I never taught you about it. I was never asked to, I never thought to, I never agitated to, and I think that's quite an important thing that is changing very quickly, and we'll be having discussions here about that very thing in the next couple of days. I've got some questions on the screen in front of me, and there are quite a number coming in, so I'm going to try and pick on a couple. One of them from Sarah Ahmed, who asks, how do we respond to the rhetoric that refugees are a threat?
So, I mean, there's a simple empirical question, which is, for instance, when it comes to terrorism, are refugees more likely to be involved in terrorist attacks in the rich world? And the evidence is just no, just in point of fact, no. Now, in the US, one of the things that's often discussed is the claim that people who are foreign born are more likely to be involved in US terrorist attacks. And I think you can identify over about the last 50 years, about 3,000 deaths that have taken place on US soil as a result of people who maybe came via asylum routes. Now, the majority of those deaths took place in 9/11, and most of those deaths weren't caused by people who had come through asylum routes. It was usually other visas. And those that weren't were significantly as a result of Cuban dissidents in the 1970s. Aside from those two events, it's very, very difficult to find any terrorist attacks that have taken place as a result of people who have got refugee status anywhere. And it's not in any way more likely that a refugee is involved in a terrorist attack than anyone from the general population. So the first way is the facts. But I'm aware that facts don't persuade people by themselves, unfortunately. Hopefully they should. But we also need narratives. We also need a way of telling stories that convince people that they don't need to be afraid of people who are different from them, educating them that refugees come for particular reasons, that they're often actually fleeing threats. They're fleeing countries where there may be terrorists, non-state armed actors, persecuting governments, that they are victims of those things that we are afraid of. They are not, for the most part, the perpetrators. The narratives that we need to change, though, don't just come from telling stories. One of the things we find in our research is one of the key things that drives positive perceptions of refugees is interactions with refugees. The more, even in the East African context, the more host community members have conversations with refugees, the more they have business interactions with refugees, the more they share meals with refugees, the more positive their attitudes are towards them. So in our community, we've got to ensure that people can meet people that are different from them, spend time with them, understand that they're not a threat, build relationships. We have to create spaces where people can relate to people. And in the UK, one of the most striking things for me is the people who are most opposed to immigration often live in the areas with the least immigration or have the least interaction with immigrants. And actually, some of the most inclusive, tolerant areas are those with the highest numbers of immigrants and refugees. So let's get people interacting with one another. Let's get them understanding that difference isn't a scary thing. It can be a really enriching and empowering thing. And we have to do that because our societies are polarizing. The economic challenges that we're going to see with economic downturn are going to make that more difficult. We've seen that some of the worst backlash against migration and some of the consequences of populism, including voting patterns in the UK, Germany, in the US, are in areas that have undergone deindustrialization, where a lot of white, traditionally working class people have lost jobs. And those are the areas where people are often worried about immigration. Underlying that, they're often worried about economic threats or economic challenges that have very little to do with immigration. So education is key, clarity on the facts is key, but also just ensuring that interact and learn from one another. But we won't persuade everyone all of the time.
Thank you. Another question from Rafaela De Negri, who writes, Professor, do you think that due to COVID-19, the definition of refugees is going to change? For example, someone fleeing a country where the government are not successful in controlling the virus.
So I don't think the definition of refugee will change as a result of COVID-19. I don't think we're going to get COVID-19 refugees being recognized because they flee the effects of COVID-19. But I do think there's a broader trend, which I touched on briefly when I talked about climate change, which is that the things that are driving people to flee their countries are very different now from what they were in 1951, when we created the basis of the definition of who's a refugee. And courts, national governments often try to sort of shoehorn current circumstances into an old legal definition. And it doesn't always work. At some point, there's going to need to be a lot of thinking about where we draw the line between forced and voluntary migration, how we decide who has a human rights-based entitlement to cross a border in light of many people who do have a need to cross borders no longer being recognized as refugees. And climate change, I think, is one of the many issues that brings that to the fore. But behind that, we see many contexts where you've got really mixed, complex drivers of displacement. Central America, the countries in Central America, the mixture of gang violence, weak governance, climate change, the collapse of livelihoods, those complex interactions of factors that are leading to people moving to survive are not reducible to the existing definition of a refugee. But the problem is, if we were to renegotiate the 1951 convention tomorrow, the risk would be we would get a worse deal. The political moment is not an auspicious moment for governments coming together and improving refugee rights. And so we will have to revisit the definition at some point, but there's a good pragmatic argument to say that now might not be the right time.
One final question from me as we wrap up. And this is one I think that is directed really from this community here at Bootham as a school. What would you encourage our young people to do if they, which many of them are concerned about this issue and have a heart for this sort of situation? What are the things that you would encourage a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old to be doing in order to make a contribution, both internationally and locally, to improve the lot of refugees and policy towards them?
So I suspect when I was 15, I didn't know what the word refugee meant. So I think the first thing to do is actually just to be informed, to know something about who a refugee is, that a refugee is someone fleeing war and an authoritarian government who has particular needs, and to talk about it, to be prepared to talk to your friends, your family, people you know, and ask them what they know about refugees. Have the conversation, because the more we get people talking about this issue, the more we'll get them engaging, learning, thinking, being curious. I think beyond that, though, one of the things that when Chris was teaching me and when I was at school, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I went off to university not quite sure what I wanted to do. And that was one of the reasons I studied economics. And it was only when I had the chance to go and do voluntary work in a reception centre for refugees and asylum seekers in the Netherlands that I actually discovered what I found to be my purpose. And my purpose, as I thought of it at the time and still do, was to be able to contribute to understanding why people who at the time I thought were less fortunate than me were in the situation they were in, and what I could do to advocate on their behalf and learn from them. And I think one of the things I would say is find whatever that purpose is, and try to make it something that is driven by your values, that you're inspired by to want to change in the world. And I feel really lucky for what the refugees I've met, particularly at that stage of my life, gave me in terms of the inspiration to have a focus and a purpose. And so much of what I've done has rewarded me by being able to learn about the world and feeling that I can contribute to something through research and through academic work. So I think find whatever it is that you are passionate about. And if it happens to be local, great. If it happens to be global, great. If it happens to be focused specifically on refugees, great, but it might be something else. I think one of the most important things is that we all work in small ways and bigger ways to create tolerant, inclusive societies, and that we do things that support human rights for people.
Thank you so much for that answer, and thank you so much for speaking so powerfully to the young people at Bootham who are watching this now. We're watching it in the future, I hope, as they get a chance to see it. Alexander, it's been a great pleasure to meet you after all these years. I jolly well hope that sometime in the future we'll be able to get together in New York itself, maybe at that restaurant that serves the haggis masala that we were speaking about before we joined us earlier on. Your presentation was really powerful in terms of developing my understanding of the global situation, of putting it in the context of what's happening now, but encouraging me in particular to see the importance of freeing those who find themselves in the position of being refugees to make a contribution to the societies in which they're living and the communities that they are building around themselves. I think there's some really powerful threads there, which I found very encouraging amidst the darkness and the difficulty. So my grateful thanks to you for your contribution, and I hope that we'll be able to get you up here in person once this wretched virus is over, to work with us at school and to help the wider community through Refugee Action York, a group of which I'm deeply impressed and we're very glad to be working with, help them too. So thank you ever so much. Have a safe pandemic. I hope the birth of your little one in October goes really well, and we'll see you in York at some point in the future.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you to everyone who joined from home. Really delighted, and I look forward to seeing you in York at some point when all this is over or different.
That would be great. Thank you. And I wonder if people have got comments they want to leave of thanks and appreciation, and maybe further questions. Please do keep on putting your comments and your questions on the YouTube or the Facebook pages, so that we can see them and so that we can feed those back. It's been great to have you with us tonight. It's been great that you have been attending in, I don't know how many numbers, but the number of different names coming off my screen is encouraging. All the very best to you. Take care, be safe, and we hope to welcome you back to Bootham next year for next year's lecture, and to see you in person and to hear the warmth of that applause with our own ears. All the best. Take care of yourselves.